Welcome everyone. We're gonna start. We have just right in the room here with a talented researcher, but also a concertina player, expert in UFO. If you came to the talk last year, and secret manuscripts, who's gonna tell us things about more manuscripts. Yeah. And cryptography statistics, we will see. I have to tell you that the event is being recorded for your awareness and will be posted online after the event. And I think that's all. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. As Nick said, I'm Josh Wright. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Oxford Internet Institute, but this is also representing a blog that I run called Weird Data Science, if you want to look up the details and further code and data and statistics that go along with it. Wow, thank you all for coming. I thought there'd be about 5 people here. Just before I start, I've got a note here that says, the Oxford Internet Institute and the University of Oxford do not support or condone the use of mathematics to peel back the fabric of reality and unleash unknown horrors on our fragile minds. Paranormal data science is not a recognized academic discipline at the University of Oxford. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get a note from the university in 18-point Comic Sans font, yeah, so let's see if we can get started on this. So a bit of context. We're going to talk about writing, about information, about the things that we have discovered in the history of humanity. And when you go back in time, the history of writing and the written word is full of magic and secrets, the occult, symbolism. If you look back at some of the earliest writing that was ever recorded, that we've ever found, they were efforts to divine what the spirits of the ancestors were telling us about the future, or about the current state of affairs, particularly if you look at Chinese ancient history. Obviously, many people will be familiar with the Egyptian hieroglyphics that were sort of left undecoded for hundreds or even thousands of years. And throughout history, the information has been recorded because we want to keep these secrets, but people encipher and encode information so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Particularly in what we want to look at tonight, the context of late medieval Europe, and particularly the era as it transitions to the Renaissance, was a time full of the discovery of new ways of looking at the world, new philosophies, new discoveries, experimenting with the way the world worked, the birth of what we would now call science. At the time, natural philosophy and similar. And the time period we're going to look at was full of individuals and societies. Now, maybe a little bit later on, but if I mention names like the Bavarian Illuminati or the Rosicrucians, then you probably have some idea what I'm thinking about. There are so many people that I could bring into this discussion, into this conversation. And I feel terrible because every single line in the next couple of slides could be a lecture course unto itself. Okay. Just to pick out a few then with some relevance to what I want to talk about. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa wrote a series of 3 books, or a book in 3 volumes called De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres, which was the foundation of what became known as Hermetic philosophy, and was the dawn of what we would now call science. But at the time, remember that this included alchemy, the transmutation of metals and substances, study of astronomy, but also the link and the bridge between magic and religion. He was a student of Johannes Trithemius, alongside a very famous alchemist called Paracelsus. Again, all of these are names that deserve lectures upon lectures of their own. A second name I want to mention is John Dee, who was an alchemist and court astronomer to Elizabeth I, and he famously recorded his conversations with angels in an unknown angelic script and language, which was later termed Enochian. He called it the angelic script. One of the things that's particularly interesting about John Dee, and again, his life is something you couldn't make up, but as one of the people at the time that had a rich library in a time when writing and books were extremely expensive and rare, he owned a copy of a book called the Book of Soiga, which was enciphered, which was encrypted, unable to be read, which is a treatise on magic, demonology, astrology, the names of angels and similar topics, which currently resides in the Bodleian Library. So just nip over there and you can go and have a look at it for yourself. But the secrecy of these manuscripts, the secrecy of these documents was not necessarily just due to how they were written. You know, the knowledge itself was difficult to understand. You needed to understand the context to understand the documents. But throughout history, the people that owned this knowledge, that developed this knowledge, were interested in hiding it from the eyes of people who weren't sort of sufficiently enlightened or sufficiently educated to understand it. If we look back into antiquity, obviously one of the most famous is Julius Caesar's cipher that he used to encode his military orders, a very simple encryption system by modern reckoning, but worked well enough for Caesar in sort of 0 AD for his military communications. Particularly the alchemists that I've mentioned, Paracelsus and others, guarded their works with extreme secrecy and encrypted them in various ways. And then as we move forward to the sort of Enlightenment era, there were various secret societies with secret rituals that encoded in their books different ways of writing. A famous one was what's called the Copial Cipher of the Oculists. The Oculists was a secret society in Europe. And a book of the Oculists was known since 1730, but was only deciphered in 2011. And I want to highlight here one of the interesting things, which is, despite the rise of computers, artificial intelligence, digital representation of information, huge amounts of speed, ciphers that were written in 1730, where we don't know the language, we don't know the context, are still something that the computers aren't breaking today. Again, Johannes Trithemius, a German Benedictine abbot, wrote two particularly interesting books, one called Steganographia and Polygraphia, that were both in a code and concerning how to encode information, how to write cryptographic books. And this is a diagram from one of those books here. And the third volume of Steganographia was not fully decoded until 1998, due to some sort of new developments in analyzing these technologies. Again, the problem I have is that I only have a short amount of time, but Johannes Trithemius, German Benedictine abbot, renowned necromancer, was apparently acquainted with the person originated in Faust legend, if you're familiar with the Faust legend. And apparently his critique of Faust was not so much that Faust entered into a deal with the devil for his soul and eventually lost his soul to the devil, but that he was just rubbish at magic. You know, that was Johannes Trithemius's main criticism. But this is the European context, and one of the things that's particularly interesting is that in the sort of Arab world, there were far more advanced developments in cryptography going on at this time. If you look outside of Europe, Al-Kindi, born in 801 CE in Baghdad, wrote a book in 841 CE called A Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages, which talked about ways to do what we would now call cryptanalyze manuscripts, ways to decipher things that you don't know how they were enciphered. One of the particularly interesting thing about Al-Kindi's work was it included mechanisms to decrypt what we call polyalphabetic ciphers. These were considered unbreakable until very late in European history. In fact, there's even I think a Scientific American article from something like 1911 that says that these methods were unbreakable if you didn't know the secret, the key to unbreaking it. And yet Al-Kindi in 841 CE was detailing means to break these. So a little bit of history, a little bit of understanding of why and how people enciphered manuscripts. But our story really begins, or the attested part of our story really begins with this amazing looking gentleman here. Wilfrid Voynich, born in 1865 in what is now Lithuania, at the time was part of the Russian Empire. And he again has a life that you would find difficult to make up. He escaped penal servitude in Siberia following revolutionary activities. He traveled by train across Europe, eventually ending up in London, and through a series of adventures became a very, very successful rare book dealer and antiquarian. In fact, possibly the most successful rare book dealer of his time. In the course of his work, he was always on the lookout for new not new, old books that he could sell on. And during a sale of the holdings of a Jesuit monastery at the Villa Mondragone in Frascati in 1912, he discovered at the bottom of a chest a book that was written in a language he didn't recognize, in an alphabet he didn't recognize, and which was filled with these amazing, sort of almost unearthly illustrations and diagrams. He kept the book until his death. He never sold it, and it now physically resides in Yale's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It's got the code MS408. And that is what is now known as the Voynich manuscript, okay, after Wilfrid Voynich. What does it contain? Well, it's a relatively small volume, apparently about 15 by 20 centimeters in size, and it contains pictures and text. The pictures are of plants, but also herbs, human figures, astronomical symbols, astrological symbols, cosmographic symbols. The script it's written in is completely unknown. It's by and large, you know, apart from some parallels that some people have drawn, it's written in an unknown script. There are a very small number of words apparently in Latin and High German. Because the script is unknown and handwritten, it's a bit difficult to say exactly how many individual letters or glyphs there are in the language, but there's approximately 25 to 30. The way the book is laid out implies that it is written in a left to right orthography. There are paragraph breaks in the manuscript, and so you can see where a paragraph ends and it starts again on the left-hand side. So it's a left to right script, unlike Arabic or Hebrew, for example. And in the time since it was discovered, it has resisted all attempts by cryptographers, historians, and linguists to decipher it. I'm going to say right now, I have not deciphered it. I'm sorry. You will get every couple of years somebody claiming to have deciphered the Voynich manuscript, and they always seem to sort of fall apart like 2 or 3 words into their translation, or it becomes very, very very sketchy. But yeah, no, this is not where this lecture is going, I'm sorry. But this is what it looks like. This is an example of the Voynich manuscript, to give you a reason and understanding why this is so compelling, why we would look at this, why we would want to work out what it's talking about. These wonderful illustrations, this sort of interesting looking writing, pages filled with different kind of things, flowers, plants, these sort of astronomical or astrological symbols here, pictures of people in pools of green water, all of this, cosmological, astrological symbols in writing. And here's a close-up, because I know that the pictures are quite small. This is a close-up of what the text actually looks like, this sort of strangely familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. You look at it and you almost think, oh, is that a G? Is that an L? Is that? But it's not. So obviously with this book discovered, people have debated, is it real? Is it genuine? Is it a hoax? Where did it come from? What are the linguistic properties in it? And people have found mentions historically of things that are believed to be references to this book. One notable one was Athanasius Kircher in 1639 wrote a letter to one Georgios Barsius of Prague via a mathematician called Theodor Moretus, which refers to a libellum steganographici mysterici, a mysterious book of cryptography or hidden writing. Athanasius Kircher was the person who had been sent this book because he famously at the time had claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, incorrectly as it turns out, but he had a reputation at the time for being somebody who could break mysterious codes. And over time, other people have looked at it, claimed various languages. Oh, we think it's Hebrew. Oh, we think it is this small, sort of obscure dialect of German from Bavaria that was spoken in the 17th century or something like that. But nobody has robustly decrypted this and shown anything convincing. In terms of the purely physical elements of the manuscript, it was constructed from contemporary 15th century materials. So the parchment from which it's made, the ink that was used to write it was contemporary. It's been dated to the period. So some questions we might want to ask about this manuscript. Is it a genuine text? Or could it just be an artificial meaningless text? Some people have suggested that it was almost almost like when people have a religious experience and start speaking nonsense. Sometimes people would write down nonsense. Could it be that? Or could it be just a hoax that somebody wrote it down to try and cause people like me to spend hours of their life looking into them? The other thing that's been identified is the diagrams fall into rough chapters. You know, there's a herbal section, there's an astrological section, there's an astronomical section. Is there any way we can look at the language and see whether these chapters are mirrored, these diagrams are mirrored in the type of writing that's there? And also just purely at the underlying text, are there any patterns or underlying linguistic shifts we can see? So, a little bit of knowledge about human languages. Human languages aren't random. You know, when we speak words, they're not all the same length, or they're not all random lengths. There's a certain, you know, shorter words tend to be more common, longer words are less common. And there's very famously, Zipf's law from 1932 has identified that human languages, by and large, tend to follow what's called a power law distribution. And what that roughly means is the frequency of a word, how often it appears in a text, is proportional to 1 over the rank order of its frequency. So an easy way of thinking about this is the most frequent word in a language is likely to be about twice as frequent as the second most frequent word, which is likely to be about twice as frequent as the third most frequent word, and so on and so forth. And this power law distribution is extremely common throughout natural phenomena. You see it all over the place. The number of people in cities, the largest city in the world is, or in a country, is likely to be some factor larger than the next, which is likely to be that constant factor larger than the next. It's not a hard law, it's very sort of variable and fuzzy, but it's a rough thing that lots of natural phenomena follow. Craters on the moon follow the same distribution. You know, the largest crater is twice as large as the second most, and so on and so forth. One of the easiest ways to see this is to plot the frequency against the rank on what's called a log-log plot. So if you plot something, usually you're using normal base 10 arithmetic. But if you take the log of both sides, you're likely to get a straight line for a log-log plot. This is often used to prove that something follows a power law, but it doesn't actually prove it. It just shows that it doesn't not follow a power law. You know, this is evidence. This is lack of evidence against rather than evidence for. But if we plot the Voynich corpus, if we take all of that text, as has been encoded by people who have represented it on the computer, we see that it does, by and large, at the beginning, follow this power law. And this tail off at the end is also well known from human languages. So we've certainly got an initial understanding that the text in the Voynich corpus seems to be consistent with the Zipf distribution, with this Zipf's law for languages. So this is some evidence that there is that it could be a human language. One of the other things that I think is worth remembering is that these statistical properties of human language were not known until about the 1930s. So if the manuscript was created in the 15th century, as it appears to have been, even if somebody had faked it, they wouldn't have known this law to make it consistent with this. Okay, so that's one argument there. And in order to see it better, just to sort of show how it fits with human languages, I've plotted it here against some other sort of well-known texts that have been translated into multiple languages. So these grey bars are the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the text of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, plotted on the same kind of axis. And you can see that the Voynich plot is very consistent with this kind of text, with a real human text. The same is true if you take the Wikipedia corpus and you plot all the different languages and their frequencies. So we can see that the Voynich manuscript there, even though we don't know what it says, we don't know what the words are, we can see that it meets a human expectation of what a language should be. So that's good. Yeah, that's a good evidence in support. Unfortunately, it's also been shown that if you just take letters, you know, if you just take the alphabet and you roll a die, a 26-sided die, and you pick a word at random, and you've also got a space character, so a 27-sided die, you will also get a Zipf-like distribution, unfortunately. So, you know, this is research. It goes up, it goes down. You have emotional roller coaster of doing this stuff. However, one of the other things that's interesting about human languages is that they don't quite meet these properties exactly. They have little deviations. And a particularly interesting finding that was seen in a paper from 2004 demonstrates that the shortest words in the language are not the most common. The most common word in English is the. The second most common word in the English language is of. So of is shorter, but is less frequent than the. And so in a study in 2004 for English, Swedish, and German, just as an example, it was found that words between 3 and 5 letters in length were the most dominant in terms of their frequency. And you can approximate this with something called a gamma distribution that peaks around 3. If you parameterize it so it peaks around 3 to 5, that is consistent with English, Swedish, and German. So what happens if we fit a gamma distribution to the text of the Voynich manuscript? We get a graph that looks a little bit like this, with the longest words dominating around 3, 4, 5. So in addition to the zip features, this actually matches language much more consistently. This thing that a human language does that a random language doesn't is consistent. So again, we have some basic belief that this could be a real language. Obviously, without uncovering the meaning, we can never be sure that the manuscript isn't just something that somebody made up. Some of these things could occur by chance, but as I said, these features weren't known at the time. People didn't know the statistical properties of languages. But given what we've looked at just now, the physical and statistical evidence gives us some feeling that it may be authentic, that we're not just looking at a hoax. So, what's our next line of attack? Well, these chapters that I've mentioned, or pseudo chapters, have been identified by a number of scholars based on the illustrations. There's astronomical ones, astrological ones, cosmological ones, herbal ones, and there are sections with no diagrams that just have sort of text with stars next to it. Is there a way that we can see whether the text matches this? Can we sort of cluster the text and put it together? Well, luckily, and many of you who are at the OII will be familiar with this, there's a thing called topic modeling that we can apply to natural language. And what is topic modeling? It's an unsupervised machine learning technique. Now, unsupervised machine learning means that, as opposed to, it's obviously in contrast to supervised machine learning. Supervised machine learning is, if you're training a machine to recognize pictures of birds, what you do is you give it lots of labeled pictures of birds and you say, this is a bird, this is not a bird. That's called supervised. You tell it what you want to find. Unsupervised machine learning is a family of techniques where you don't so much tell the machine what you want, you give it a task to do. And one of the most common tasks is clustering things together. Are these things closer to each other than these other things? And you don't give it anything, you just tell it to find those. Well, what topic modeling does is it applies this kind of clustering to text. And at a very abstracted level, it considers every unit of analysis, so a page or a chapter in a book, and it says, let's imagine that it's actually just a big bag of words, and you make the chapter by just pulling random words out of that to get the words that you want. What topic modeling does is it says, this page is likely to have come out of this bag and this collection of words here. This page is likely to have come out of this bag of words. And it's used nowadays to cluster large volumes of text that you don't want to sit and read every single one. I've used it to categorize patents, for example, and news stories. But the key thing about topic modeling is it doesn't read the words. It doesn't understand the words. It doesn't look them up in a dictionary. It doesn't put semantics next to them. It just says, this is how often they occur in these particular pages or these particular chapters. So to give you an idea of what topic modeling can do, we can take a random text that we do understand. So, for example, Margaret Murray's 1921 work, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Obviously, the first book you would choose for something like this. And if you apply, which is a wonderful book if you ever get a chance to read it. If you apply topic modeling, there are some tweaks and things that you do. You have to choose how many topics you want to split it into. But you can see here it's saying that sort of certain pages, it classifies them according to these different topics, and the topics are lists of words that occur in them. So this one, sort of witches, devil, fertility, this is talking about the sort of fertility elements of witches. This is about the rituals and the religion and the Christianity and the cults, things like that. And what it does is it says this page is likely to be talking about this topic, or it's likely to be similar to these other pages. What happens if we apply topic modeling to the Voynich manuscript? We get a series of topics like this. We don't know what these words mean. But what we do know is that they cluster together on particular pages. Does it tell us anything interesting? No, not particularly. But what I've done here is now there were different. I used when I did this work. I did a 12 model topic model, and I also came up with a 34 model one. But the 12 one is easier to read. What I've done here is I've split each page in the manuscript, each folio in the manuscript, and applied a topic model, and I've categorized it. So the topic it falls into is on the y-axis. The color is the manually applied chapter. So this long section at the beginning is the green, is the herbal section, for example. So it dominates a large part of the first sort of half to third half of the book. Then there are shorter things here, like the cosmological section is in pink here, the biological section is in purple, and you can see they do fall into categories. And so what I'm interested in here is, are certain topics closely associated only with one section, or do they split across? So if you look at topic 1, for example, it only really appears in the herbal section, and then the rest of the manuscript doesn't have topics associated with that topic, except for one in the pharmaceutical section at the end. And there are some other interesting little sort of gaps here, like this section here, topic 6 does not seem to show up in the biological or the cosmological section of the topic. So we can see some separation, but this isn't a sort of huge, we've matched the topics to the chapters. So that certainly doesn't happen. So we know that the pages fall into different categories. And what's interesting about this is we don't care about the words. We don't need to translate them. But we do see that there's some evidence that there might be clustering of words in different ways. So we need to dig deeper. We need to look further into this. And what I'm going to do is draw on tools from an area of research called stylometry, which and particularly, I'm going to apply a Bayesian statistical approach to change point analysis to say, are there points in the text where, independent of the topics, does the text shift at an interesting point? And we're particularly going to look at word length frequency, the number of words used in that are of a certain length. One of the interesting things about this is it's been used in modern language for author attribution. If you've got 5 authors that could have created a text, there are some very interesting features that you can use to distinguish between people. This was applied to the letters that were written in the American Revolution. The Federalist Papers. Thank you. It was used to because they were written anonymously, and this was used to identify the likely author of the anonymous papers. One of the things, particularly the word frequency of short words, how often do you use of and if in your writing, is actually a marker of your style of writing and can be used to identify you. Another one, according to Brinstadt et al. From Drexel University, is how often do you use the letter I in your writing? This is actually a marker of your writing style that can be used to identify you amongst other people. Maybe it wouldn't identify you out of 2 billion people, but if you've got 10 people who all write something and you want to identify them, we should apply this to marking at the OI. We shouldn't. But the usage of the letter I is an indicator of your writing style. Very interesting. And one of the things that's a wonderful example of this is a chivalric romance novel written in 1490. This is the obvious example that you would go for, called Tirant le Blanc, written by a Valencian knight, Joan Martorell. And the interesting thing particularly about this book, apart from the fact that it was Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote's favorite novel, was that Joan Martorell died before he completed the last few chapters of the book, and it was posthumously completed by his friend Martí Joan de Galba. Okay, so he wrote most of the book, something like 350 chapters, and then he died. And there's been a lot of scholarly debate historically as to how much de Galba went over and edited the whole book and contributed to the whole book, or did he just do the end bit? So in 2006, a paper was released that looked at this frequency of word lengths as a stylistic indicator of who wrote it and where the contribution was. And they found a stylistic shift between chapters 371 and 382, so right at the end of the book. So they argue that de Galba really did just finish the book and left his friend's work completed. So I coded up this model, I reproduced it. One of the ways that we do this is we consider the text, and this is, sorry, maths incoming. We're going to represent the text as a multinomial distribution. Now, a multinomial is an extension of the traditional binomial distribution. So now you understand. A binomial distribution is if you flip a coin some number of times, n times, how many heads do you get? You know, how many heads do you get in your thing? A multinomial distribution is like you do the same thing, but with a deck of cards. You draw 12 cards. How many hearts, clubs, diamonds, spades do you get? Okay, that's what a multinomial distribution is. We consider in this model the word length as your category. How many words of length 4 are there? How many words of length 5? How many words of length 6? And the number of pages in the manuscript is the number of trials that we're conducting. So that's the number of coin flips or draws. Particularly, if we want to find a point where it changes, where the style changes, we actually say, well, let's imagine there are 2 different distributions, one before the change and one after the change. And we then fit a model that says, which model best fits this entire document? Where does that change happen if we just allow there to be two models? If you want to see the maths, this is formally how I coded this up. I used a probabilistic programming language called Stan that allows you to define these models very neatly and accurately and does all the fitting for you. It's a very good tool. And we basically say there's a multinomial, and before a certain time point, it's parameterized with one set of parameters, and after the time point, it's a different set of parameters. Now go and fit the model. And very nicely, when I applied this to Tirant-LeBlanc, I reproduced the findings of the earlier study that found a most likely change point around chapters, I don't know, 370, 380, exactly where they found it. What happens if we apply that to the Voynich manuscript? Well, we get a change point that occurs very strongly. So if there isn't a significant change point, you might expect a couple of things to happen. One is it might cluster at the end, either the beginning or the end, or you might get a very diffuse thing. Oh, it could be here, it could be here, it could be here. In the Voynich manuscript, we find that there is a very significant identified change point around folio 33 of the Voynich manuscript. This was interesting. And then, given that I'd done this on the word frequency, I thought, well, we've got this topic model. Why don't we do the same thing, the same change point analysis to see, do the topic distributions change around a particular point? Is there anything that supports it there? And we get a change point on the topic model around the same point. It's more diffuse, and there are some reasons for that I won't go into. But we actually find there are 2 bits of data. Now, they're related. They're not fully independent because the language that built the topic model is the language of the other change point. But this is a change point which occurs very early on in the manuscript. It's about halfway through the herbalist section. And we can't read much more into it than that. But these are the pages. So page 33. This is online, by the way. If you go to the Voynich libraries webpage, you can find high resolution images of the Voynich manuscript. So if you want to have a look and see if you can identify what was going on before page 33 and what was going on after page 33, or before page 38 and after page 38, then you can look into it. So that's where I'm going to finish. I'm not going to go any further into this. Some conclusions. Perhaps the statistics were the real horror all along. From looking at this text that we don't understand, that we don't know the language, we don't know the text, we don't know the glyphs, we do still have certain statistical and physical pieces of evidence that say there's good evidence that this is potentially a real book from the period. This finding, I mean, it's not the most world-shifting finding in that anyone could have come up with, but there is significant evidence that the writing style, it could be a different author, it could be a different topic, but it changes very early in the book and it doesn't mirror the diagrams that are shown in the Voynich. One thing that would be interesting to do would be to look at multiple change points, where you say not there are two potential sort of sections of the book, but let's say if there were 8, do we get a good fit for a model that splits it into other chapters? And just to sort of conclude finally, the ultimate finding really is that the unknown terrors detailed in cryptic glyphs within arcane manuscripts uncovered in ancient monasteries are not free from our scrutiny and our maths. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much. I think we've got a bit of time for questions. If anyone, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I know you were talking about like the application of like stylometry on like the Voynich manuscript. I was just wondering if stylometry's like applications for like language isolates has that been used to like uncover or like sort of like decipher language isolates that were not previously understood, or has it not been like around enough long enough to like understand other like languages?
Do you mean in the context of the Voynich, or do you mean just generally?
Just like if you were to apply that same technique that you're using to analyze the Voynich, would that be able to be applied to like languages that we don't understand, and to like, and has that been used to like uncover like things about like languages that we don't understand?
So one of the interesting things about, I mean, I hate to try and be serious with this stuff, but like I think one of the things that is interesting is the delineation between what we think we need to understand something and what we can tell when we clearly don't understand it. So the Voynich is a perfect example where we don't understand the text, we don't understand the meaning, we don't know anything about it, and yet we can still tell something about it. We can still tell things, but this is not the route to translating or decrypting the Voynich. However, these tools would apply to any collection of symbols, be that language or be that, you know, sort of, I don't know, patterns of sand on a beach. You know, if there are patterns there, these tools can find them. There's a group, I believe they're at Uppsala University. There's a group called the Decrypt group. I know they've got some researchers at the University of Siegen as well, in Germany, who have a whole long project on decrypting old manuscripts, like untranslated manuscripts. Some of those are very simply ciphered, and you can use that to identify, oh, this may well be in Latin, and so now we can just go and try and translate it from the Latin. And they've got, you know, some wonderful work on doing that. The other thing that is worth mentioning with the context of the Voynich is that many of the people historically who've studied it have approached it from a more historical or linguistic perspective. So they've looked at the diagrams and they said, this diagram could be representing this plant or that plant, or this castle in this place, or, you know, this matches the, you know, the style of astrological symbols that were used in Bavaria in 1632 or something like that. And I think those are two parts of the puzzle. You know, you need that contextual analysis to understand what's going on, because there's just not enough text to try and translate it in that sense. But yeah, certainly one of the things that you could do with the Voynich is to just say, like I did with Wikipedia, is to say, you know, look, here are 50 languages, which one maybe statistically meets the Voynich text? And then we imagine that it might be that, but and people have tried that but haven't had much success. But that's when you get these regular stories of people who claim they've decrypted it or translated it. That's often what they've done. So, but there's a whole world of Voynich scholarship, and I've tried to be a bit lighthearted here, and I'm very conscious of the people that have been working on this very seriously. I mean, the NSA wrote a study, I think in the 1970s or 1980s, called An Elegant Enigma, where the NSA tried to decrypt the Voynich manuscript and eventually gave up. So, you know, there's been serious work on this. So yeah. Oh, you go ahead and then yeah.
Thank you. I have a like basic but maybe a silly question here. I'm wondering, how could you put these images or this unknown text on computer and then do this machine learning? And then my second question is further, like, how could you experience this cluster effective? Because we don't really know this kind of characters has meaning. And because for human language, like space or blank really matters.
Mhm.
But for that kind of language or what we tell that stuff, maybe the blanks or space doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think sort of, as I implied early in the lecture, or I should recognize the work of people that have taken these glyphs and turned them into the computer representation of that. So, there's a very simple, you can, when I built these models, I was working with just very short text files that are just, this letter would be represented by an E on the computer or something like that. Some of the assumptions that I've made, which I think are not very controversial assumptions, are given the style of writing, and given the context in which it was found, a European manuscript, the word boundaries are quite clear in terms of spacing here. So it seems to be a space language. And like I said, the evidence that it's a left to right language is in this sort of paragraph breakdown here, where the paragraph ends here or ends here. Whereas if this were Arabic or Hebrew, then the paragraph would end on this side or on this side. So there's that. I mean, it has been suggested, any language you can imagine has been suggested as a potential language for the Voynich manuscript. Certainly Chinese has been suggested as a potential, but and obviously it could be many things. There are linguistic forms beyond the alphabet that aren't. There's the Abugida, where vowels aren't represented in many situations. You've got sort of Korean writing where you've got syllable groups as opposed to individual letters. And to some extent, that's an assumption I've made here. However, even without that assumption, the it's not language learning models, but the topic modeling and the text frequency approaches don't consider these as words. They consider them as abstract symbols that they don't. So they're just looking for patterns in symbols. And so these could be, these could represent numbers, sequences of numbers. And the system would still be trying to find what are the patterns in these sequences of numbers. So that one of the things I find interesting about this is giving up control, as in, I don't understand it. Let's see what we can tell if I don't try to understand it. Let's see what comes out anyway. But yeah, that's good.
I guess it was actually, I think the answer part of my question. I was kind of wondering about, for a script like here, it seems like we can kind of tell the letters, but would this same kind of strategy work if we were like looking at Arabic for the first time and nobody had any experience what Arabic was like? Would we know where to see it? It seems like you do have to assume what an individual letter is.
Yeah, and for Arabic, yes, but for Chinese, particularly classical Chinese, no. In fact, this is one of the problems with classical Chinese nowadays, where people try to go back and translate, is there was no word spacing, there was no punctuation, and so there are, and given the way that Chinese is formed, two separate words that would have one meaning can be joined together to have a particular different meaning, or could be a name, or could be something else. So it could fall down for that kind of thing. There are other ways of thinking about it, in that, for example, if this was deliberately encrypted as opposed to just being written in a script that we don't understand, it could be that the spaces are significant. The word letters are actually representing part of it. There was a cipher by Roger Bacon. I'm sorry, Roger Bacon and Francis Bacon were both influential philosophers who did similar things, but at different times. And I think it was Roger Bacon had a cipher that actually used two alphabets. So the word was written in one, and there was a different typeface letter above it that changed the meaning of it, and that was put into 5-letter blocks. So you can imagine anything with this. But the other thing that I think is worth remembering to some extent is the surrounding historical context of the cryptography that was available at the time. Julius Caesar, in sort of his conquest of Britain, sort of 0 AD era, was using a cipher that just swapped letters of the alphabet. A became D, B became E, C became F. And that was considered good enough for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, certainly in Europe. Whilst Trithemius did come up with his sort of far more complex methods, they weren't widely used. So, this could be in an unknown language, in unknown glyphs, and encrypted as well, or it could be any combination of those. So, but yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah.
Is there like a deeper reason why people want to decode this beyond simply like the kind of magical, mysterious nature of the story and this rare book? Is there like a, I don't know, like a deeper intention?
What else could there be? No, I mean, certainly it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. It's compelling. It's people look at it and try to identify, what plant is this? What plant could this actually be? Maybe that's going to be the path into it. But no, there's no sort of hint that, if we decrypt this, then it's going to contain the unified field theory or something like that. It really is, certainly from my perspective, it's a puzzle. We don't understand it, and eternal fame and glory if you make any findings on it. But it's also just a lovely thing to look at, and I guess it says something about my active social life that this is what I did with a Saturday night. But yeah.
If you had to bet, how long would you say it will take us to figure it out?
I really couldn't, because it really is, there's not enough information here. If this was one volume out of a library of 1,500 volumes in the same language, in the same text, I would say computers getting better, machine learning, we'd find it. This is just on its own, out there. It could be a hoax. It's a wonderful hoax if it is, and it's worth. And I think one of the other things that I like about the work that I have done is, and in fact, the whole reason why, so the Weird Data Science blog, like last year I did UFO sightings, this year I've done the Voynich Manuscript, this is really fun to do. And I've used the techniques that I used on this in other research, in other work that I've done that has potentially more value and meaning and seriousness behind it. And so I think from a sort of practitioner's perspective, this is playing with your tools to become more familiar with them. And it took me ages to make the graphs look like this, finding the right fonts and like getting the right background and making ggplot in R look like this. And and yet, what happens, even things like, these nice little sort of labels and things like that. And yet you've got that code. And when I want something to look a bit more serious, I've got a library of code. I've got an R package called Grimoire that gives me all of these for free. And that's, it's if you're having fun with it, then you're improving yourself, and you can do other things with it. So I think, yeah, it's as the NSA put it, it's an elegant enigma. It's something that is very fun to work on. And if you find for example, this hasn't changed the world, that there is a change point potentially on folio 33 of the Voynich manuscript, but it might lead to something. I might do another 2 or 3 change points and find, what, this meets some chapters, and that could lead to something else. But at the same time, like I say, I've applied this to other areas of research where it's had a lot more value in identifying things. So I would encourage everyone, not necessarily to go and study the Voynich manuscript, but don't lose sight of the fun of what you're looking into, because that's what it's all about. Yeah.
Just on that, how open are people? I guess maybe it's hard to know, but you're making it sound like kind of open science. You're going to solve one bit of it and it'll help others. And do people like hoard their own kind of Voynich secrets, or is it a nice collaborative?
It's almost a meta one, given that's kind of what the Voynich manuscript itself is likely to be, is hoarding knowledge. It varies. There's a lot of open research out there. There's not a huge amount of academic publication on it. There is some. There's a journal called Cryptologia, which about the history of cryptography, and there is some work there. There's lots of internet forums, but when you work on something that kind of is conspiracy adjacent, you have to tread carefully. But there's some wonderful people working on Voynich stuff. like I said, this group in Uppsala who are doing this for a lot of historical documents. They don't focus on the Voynich. They've got lots of others, but so there's an open science bit, but there's also going to be closed things out there. But yeah, it's enjoyable. It's fun. Yeah.
I guess continuing down with this theme of like kind of more fun questions, how did you stumble upon this to begin with?
Yeah, loneliness, basically. No, no. I mean, so you know, my path through this is I'm a computer science. I was a teen hacker. You know, when I was 14, I was interested in hacking, computer security. Went to university to study computer science. Became interested in security. Did a PhD in anonymous communication systems, and increasingly interested in the sort of statistics and that, but then also a history of, you know, I grew up during the X-Files boom in the 90s, and I'm a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and you know, all of these things come together, and you know, something like this doesn't you know, fall outside my attention for very long, and then yeah, and then like I say, just long evenings where I'm programming R rather than, you know, watching Coronation Street or something like that. So yeah.
Is it possible there's a code book to match with that illegal machine? You need the rotor setting. Once you know the rotor setting, you can decode.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Something like this, certainly when I mentioned that Trithemius's book Steganographia was, you know, the first 2 volumes, the key to them was published shortly after they were released, but then the 3rd volume wasn't sort of decrypted effectively until I think it was 1998. If that key had been known, and you know, for a real cipher, there generally is a key. It could be that somewhere out there is, you know, the book, you know, the little cheat sheet that lets you understand this. But I mean, this is one of the things that I haven't mentioned, which is obviously relevant to this, is the Rosetta Stone, where linear A and linear B were these sort of fully sort of not understood mystical writing systems. Nobody understood them. Nobody knew what they meant. Then the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which had Greek linear A and linear B text saying the same things. And so you had a translation from Greek, which was known, and then you had linear A and linear B, and that cracked the whole thing open. So it could be that there's a Voynich Rosetta Stone out there, but it could also be that it was, you know, this is coming from an era where people used to reuse paper. They used to scrape off the ink and because it was so valuable and expensive. So it could be that that's lost, never to be found again. But absolutely, it could well be. Maybe we should all be going to Frascati and scouring the monasteries there. So yeah.
Is there any question online?
Oh no, I've just seen I just text saying please add any questions into the Q&A. So yeah.
Have you read much of what Lisa Fagan Davis has written on the different authorships and things like that? Or
in the course of researching this,
she seems to be quite interested in that same topic.
Yeah, I think the answer is I'm familiar with the name, but I haven't read the background.
Well, you might want to because there's an overlap of interest. That's all with what you're interested in.
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, there's a, you know, this could be an 8-lecture series on the Voynich manuscript, and I would quite happily give it. But yeah, there's a lot of work on this, and one of the things that I love about this, because it ties into this sort of my philosophy of how to do research, is that we can apply modern statistical machine learning tools, but without the surrounding context, what other people have done. But also, if this was made in the 1500s, then it's not just a case of, oh, it's in Latin. It's going to be in 15th century Latin of the place where it was created, or other languages around there, which is why it's not so simple as just sort of saying, does it match the frequencies of, you know, Hungarian on Wikipedia or something like that. So no, there's a huge, you know, I should say this very openly, there's a huge literature out there for anyone who wants to.
I don't know much about that topic personally, but she's written about how she's compared the glyphs from the different pages and noticed that there's actually a different hand and different authors who've written.
Well, so that would
be. And she's sort of medieval head of the Medieval Academy of America or
So,
something.
I mean, it would be, yeah, so I haven't come across it, but it would be interesting to see whether it has any relevance to the
Yeah,
change.
I would
Yeah.
say that, and also,
Yeah.
Courier A and B, that ties in with that kind of thing as well.
Okay.
Prescott Courier, who wrote in the 20th century about these different changes, so might all tie in with what you would be interested in.
No, it's, I mean, yeah, I mean, so that's one of the things that you lose when you look at the text just purely as data, is you lose the hand. And so, you know, there's, you know, the style of writing, you know, how the glyphs were formed. And, you know, there's parallels with code breaking during the Second World War, where people could sort of recognize particular telegraph operators from the way that they tapped Morse code into the system. It's an interesting thing of, you know, what data do you choose to include in your model and what do you choose to discard? But yeah, no, that's really interesting. So yeah,
this time. I find it interesting how you use like computational methods to try to test statistical hypotheses. So maybe there's a change point. Where is a change point? Can the computational methods help figure this out? How deeper do you think we can go on, like either hypothesis testing or even beyond? Could we test whether it could be a translation from another language or it cannot be? Or could we use computational methods like red team, blue team? One algorithms try to create a new language and another try to test hypotheses.
Train ChatGPT on the Voynich text. Yeah, no, that's great. And to some extent, the sort of statistical school that I follow is more about less so much a hypothesis test, but does the change point model describe what we observe better than a non-change point model? Does a 2 change point model fit the data better? You know, obviously with penalization for how many change points you've added, because the more things you add, the more features you add into the data set or into the model, the better it's going to fit naturally, but then you can overfit and things like that. So, and obviously with such a short text, it's problematic to begin with. But I think I think this kind of approach with more fuzziness and uncertainty in it, and sort of saying, well, it could potentially be this one or potentially be this one. You know, there are other things you could look at. One of the, how many minutes have I got? One of the things that you do with topic modeling traditionally is you cut off the, you cut words down to their stems. So for say English, you know, you've got you know, run, ran, running, and you would cut off the endings and just make that a word run. So you just get the kind of verb there. Obviously, we can't do that with the Voynich. So it would consider the words, it would consider the, you know, the Voynichese equivalent of run and running to be 2 completely different words. Whereas if we knew more, we could sort of join those together. So it could be interesting to, and I know that some people have done this, it could be interesting to try and identify stems in the language and sort of say, okay, you know, these, you know, the first 3 or 4 letters are consistent, and yet there are endings that are identified there. But that's very difficult as well, depending on the type of language, because if it was Turkish, which is a sort of highly agglutinative language, you know, the whole word can be constructed out of that. So again, the deeper you go into it, maybe the more assumptions you start to make, and you have to make those assumptions. So but yeah, I mean, I think my quick win is I want to do multiple change point analysis rather than a single change point. But yeah, we'll see how much time I have this. So I think, unless there are any questions left, I think we've just hit our time limit. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a happy Halloween. Don't spend too much time delving into arcane tomes of mystery and magic, or do, you know, you're in Oxford. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks.